allow me to introduce our next speaker, Sagar Beroshi.
I thought I would let my slides do my talking for me. Hello! Hi! Are you aware that it's 3:30 on a Sunday afternoon and that I'm not wearing a watch? But you made it here, and you are all here to see a talk that had the word history in its title. Congratulations! I think the key question, for me at least, is who are you? Because this is a talk that's geared towards anyone who is now, or who anticipates soon, being involved in the conception of a game's narrative. Now, if you're a game director now, if you are a narrative lead, if you are a writer, if you are a designer, maybe you publish narrative games, maybe you are none of the above now, but intend to be. My hope is that this talk is a little bit for you. So, as our medium matures year after year in our storytelling, in what we do, it's only natural that we want to make use of more and more sophisticated narrative tools. So the goal of this talk is relatively modest. It's to focus on the craft, provide a tool set, label that tool set, and show how we might make use of it. So my focus is the specific moment when the writer's room meets for the first time for a project. When you, the writer, are staring at a blank page, maybe. When characters and ideas are swooping in and out with alacrity. So in this feverish moment, whether you are ideating solo or in a group, you're probably getting a constant churn of generating ideas and self-editing those ideas. That is entirely normal. What survives that process depends on the you that arrived at that moment and all the baggage you brought with you. That's what our focus is going to be. That's what this talk is about. So, who am I to cover this topic? I am coming to you as a peer. I currently work in game direction with a foundation in narrative design and production. I have worked on 3 continents in more than 10 work sectors. Like most people, I have a very particular biography that, of course, significantly influences my very particular point of view. I'm a millennial born in the Great Lakes region of North America, and I live now in North London. I have done for 7 years, and the very fact that I said I have done and not I have done so tells you how many years I've been here. I studied politics, modern history, and international relations from a US perspective. I'm of Gujarati origin, that's Western India. Half Jain, half Hindu, fully atheist. I am married to a Mexican who herself has lived all over the world, and I have a little baby girl who people apparently tell me is going to be British and is going to have make sense of all of this biography. So, I have worked on narrative from a few distinct perspectives, and I'd like to talk about just a couple of them, the most prominent ones. I was part of the proudly London-based team at Interior Night making this game. A few of us are still here in the crowd. This game, As Dusk Falls, is on Xbox's Game Pass. I was a producer at one point or other for most of the story-centric teams in the studio. We made a branching cinematic crime drama game. It was set mostly in the southwestern United States, and it was in the late 90s, which horrifyingly means that it was classified as a period piece. This is true. This is true. This was a very consciously narrative game. By contrast, I'm working now with the Stockholm-based Arrowhead Game Studios, where I am the deputy game director on an interim basis for Helldivers 2. We're releasing in February, and this does not look like the other game, right? No, it doesn't. This is a slightly more mainstream game. It's a space shooter inspired by sci-fi literature of the 60s and sci-fi cinema of the 80s and 90s. Now, what sets this particular game apart, why I was interested in it, is that it uses satire and irony to tell its story. It parodies other more self-serious space shooters, and it directly satirizes Western foreign policy from the early 2000s, a topic I happen to know a little bit about. So, both of these projects, as different as they are, on the surface have something in common with each other, and I would venture something in common with many of the projects that many of you might be working on. They draw their key protagonist conflicts from the last few decades or so. To very, very heavily simplify, As Dusk Falls' narrative conflicts are fueled by a uniquely American cocktail of poverty and desperation and violence, and Helldivers 2's narrative conflicts are fueled by the absurdity and ruin resulting from nationalistic arrogance. Now, these are strong narrative conceits. You can get a lot from these ideas, particularly if the mechanics and the aesthetics also are strong. But these are ultimately recent styles of conflicts. Of course, they have existed throughout history, but the things we were most inspired by were in living memory, let's say. Now, for any era of human history, and our current one is no exception, we tend to have a particular way of thinking about things. We attach value to particular things, and we think it is entirely impossible that humanity has ever felt differently about a different way of operating, a different way of living. We share certain understandings about modernity no matter our national origin, and we forget that there may have been other ways of thinking about things like romantic norms, how one ought to spend money, what a government should do for its people, why one might have to emigrate or want to emigrate, all sorts of things. And if we only ever make use of our current model, well, that's great, incredibly relevant, but there's a whole host of human history that came before that is equally valid and equally human. We can base our stories there as well. So when you have a blank page, you can go in kind of any direction. And if you're willing to accept my premise that the full breadth of human experience has conflicts that are wider and weirder and more wonderful than the ones that we happen to be most familiar with, then one of the best ways to draw on a wider pool of ideas is just to catalog them. And I would suggest not from the top down, rather than saying, I'm interested in, say, the conflicts associated with the transfer of power in a country. If you start with that, it's more likely that you might end up with tropey ideas if you're trying to fill that initial promise. However, I suggest we go the opposite way. Instead, we gather a constellation of specific use cases. I am calling them conflict nuggets like this, and build up from there. Build an architecture founded by those types of ideas and those types of stories. So the message here, right, is not to set more games in the real or fictional past. That might be nice. I really like historical games, but that's not the goal of this talk. The goal here is to plumb history, find real, genuinely human conflicts, and use them to power your narrative, whether the actual game you are making is realistic fiction, sci-fi, or something else entirely. Okie dokie. It's about time, I think, that we cover an example. So one of my own conflict nuggets comes from Mexican history, which I will assume is new to a good number of you here. What you need to know for the purposes of this particular anecdote is that Mexico was colonized by Spain for many, many centuries. In the early 1800s, after nearly 300 years, the local population was fed up with this and revolted. So the overall story of the Mexican War of Independence is long and complex and bloody, as many wars of independence are, but our focus is squarely on its earliest phases. So at the very beginning, the early uprising in Mexico was led by two key personalities, and it's the disagreement between them that forms this conflict nugget. On one hand, we have this man, Miguel Hidalgo, and on the other, we have this man, Ignacio Allende. Both of them were revolutionaries, so that means both of them fought against European rule. I say European because the Napoleonic Wars messed everything up and it was all very complicated, but we're not going to go into that. But they had dramatic disagreements over the best way to run this revolution in ways that you might find surprising. So take a look at these portraits, right? You might not be surprised to hear that Allende here was a military man. He served in the army. He had a disciplined and a planned approach for how to initiate and manage his conspiracy, right? He was a producer. But if you look at Hidalgo, you might see something a little bit different. He's portrayed differently. Hidalgo was a priest. He was a priest who personally started a war of independence with the most famous speech in Mexican history. And he is a person who is sanctified today as the father of Mexico. Speak to any of your Mexican friends, and they will speak to you about El Grito. Given these associations, you might expect that Hidalgo was a wise and moralizing leader. He was a priest, of course. He might have even felt a bit Christ-like in the way he did this, while Allende must have been the fierce, avenging, unapologetic sword. Well, instead, if you actually go into this, historians have generally settled on the fact that during this phase of the conflict, Hidalgo was known for violence and excess of the army that he headed as it sacked and brutalized cities across Mexico. Allende, on the other hand, hated this. He feuded with Hidalgo in an attempt to control the ferocious energies Hidalgo had unleashed. Both men ended up with their heads cut off and hung from spikes in front of a prison that they had attacked together. Okay, heavy stuff, right? But do you see how extraordinary this very specific conflict is, and how it might give you a character setup that is both more honest and more unusual than one you might have come up with on your own? It's especially the case because the reality is you usually have 1,000 other things to do when you are doing your character briefs, right? You have time-boxed yourself 1 hour at the end of a Thursday in which to finally finish this brief before you send it off to the casting director or something like this, right? So when you are in that type of moment, if you are coming just from your brain down, you might tend to think about things that are more common to your experience than ones that might be less common to your experience. So just think about how you might use a specific conflict nugget like this in a project. Maybe you're working on something with themes of the military or of a revolution or of balancing powerful different forces. You might have a character who is nominally the moral leader, like Hidalgo, and that character ends up wielding power that they can perhaps barely control. You might have another character who is nominally the muscle, more organized, more professional, but less charismatic. Maybe your protagonist gets to be the Hidalgo of your story. Maybe they get to be the Allende. Maybe they get to pick who they get to be. This could be a central narrative conflict. It could drive your entire story. It could be a side quest. It could just fill out the middle part of your game. It could be something that manifests in a more trivial way, or it could be used with big stakes. But these types of characters, these types of central nuggets can fit quite a number of different genres. So if I, 5 minutes ago, had asked you to think of characters to fill a military story, would you have thought about a character conflict like this specific one? But if I asked you now, it's at the top of your mind, right? It's something you might be thinking about. It's a set of things that you might use as a trigger when you're trying to do more research. Remember, we're focusing on the blank page, the moment where you have nothing. Not the moment where you already have an outline and you already have clarity on who everyone is. I am saying that there is no such thing as the immaculate conception of an idea. I think that we bathe and we scrub our minds in a specific context. And I think that when you are usually trying to think of new ideas, you do something like the following. You consider what's happening in society, current events, things that are of interest to you. You consider maybe the highest achieving works in your genre or in your medium. And you try to think about how you, with your skills, might be able to do something better. In other words, you take a context, you apply your own personal approach, and you generate a concept. The point of collecting these conflict nuggets is to vary that context, right? To churn it up, to shake it up a little bit more than you might have done otherwise. So the question is how to go about doing it. The first thing you have to do is to acknowledge the specific current cultural moment that we are in and the lessons that we've picked up as storytellers. We are in a period of correctly correcting against past wrongs in all sorts of storytelling media, not least of which is ours. Wrongs of grabbing bits from another culture, oversimplifying, stereotyping, offending. Those of us in the narrative subgenre of games, we probably feel this concern most of all because we take our characters seriously. We take our fictional world seriously. And we want our audience to know that they're in responsible hands. So when you hear me giving an example like the one I did about Hidalgo and Allende, you might remember that I mentioned I'm married into a Mexican family. And you might say, well, it's all fine and good for you, Sagar, to bring forth examples like this. Your ability to do this is linked to your biography. Or actually, maybe you don't think that. Maybe you think I shouldn't have even said that. That's fine too. If you are comfortable, you can of course focus on conflict nuggets from whatever part of whatever society you think it's okay for you to go deeper into. The past is a foreign country, right? Go far back in time, do proper research, and you'll find extraordinary things everywhere. So just keep that in mind as you move on forward. But I think maybe you can tell by the way that I'm phrasing this that I recommend you do your search widely. We don't want to only take an inward-focused stance with moral preoccupations tied to the present, or just to the types of game stories that we already know and like. That way leads us to having AAA games that are all big shooters that are taking relatively rare risks, Or, frankly, also in the indie world, where we often move our story setting to something new, but we still tie it to the specific moral concerns of the present moment. And by the way, there is actually nothing wrong with this, right? Fiction has an entirely important role in commenting on our present and helping us interpret that. That is part of what we do. That's the bread and butter, right? That's the 60, 70% of the types of things that we produce and that every other type of medium produces. But we are here at this conference to define the future of games narratives, right? And to think about how we might be able to tell more complex stories to a more complex and sophisticated audience with more complex needs from their fiction. So, in a sense, when you were at that blank page, my advice is diverge more. And this is the way that you can do it. Let's establish a few fundamentals, okay? Or at least my own fundamental assumptions about how things might work. Human history, in my opinion, is not a single unbroken line from dropping out of trees to eat some fermented fruit straight through to Beat Saber. Okay? It's like a country's waterways, right? We move sometimes over land, sometimes underground, sometimes we go fast, sometimes it goes slow, sometimes history finishes in a pool, sometimes it rejoins the main current, but it always maintains this flow of brooks and eddies and the serpentine shape as the Thames has. What I would say is that no matter what we've worn, no matter what our morals of the moment were, no matter what our geopolitics were like, or what languages we spoke, I posit that people have been more or less the same all through history. Now, you can disagree with that, but that's an assumption I'm going to take forward, as long as we are talking about Homo sapiens. Yeah? I'm not going back to Homo erectus or any of our other fellow Homo species. I'm just saying, if we are talking about our species, even if the context was different, the fundamental process was pretty similar. If you took me as a baby, dropped me amongst a community crossing the Bering Land Bridge 20,000 years ago, and you waited another 36 years, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between me and anyone else from that society. And I would probably look nothing like I happen to right now. So, let's think about how we think through history. Okay, so this is a bit of a model, and at the end of this slide, and don't worry, I'll tell you when it's done, it'll be a nice picture moment, okay? Because I always take pictures halfway through these slides, and then they just keep going, and then I'm like, if they'd only told me when I was done, I wouldn't have to delete all of these other pictures beforehand, right? So, our strongest personal associations are defined by the last 10 years or so. Nothing unusual about that. That's what you remember the most well. Our cultural and political forces, however, tend to only really remember the last 80 to 100 years. From a global perspective, I'm talking about. What that means for our society is that post-World War II, right? Now, we can still associate with people who are in this next window. Think, for example, about how it feels when you read a Jane Austen novel. But that tends to be within single cultures, right? I am guessing that most of you who grew up in an Anglo culture probably couldn't name one work by Molière, but it's perhaps very relevant to people from that other culture. So when we get to this phase, our historians and our archaeologists, they have enough data to bring events to life going back this far. But it tends to be at the population level. So when we tend to have an idea of what old people were like and what the old times were like and the old ways, it tends to come from this window. Now, if we go this far back, things get crazy, right? We've forgotten entire civilizations, entire societies having existed. This is true. These are normal societies full of people just like us. You don't even remember that they existed at all. You wouldn't even be able to place them on a map. And that's not because you're not well educated. That's simply because human history is long and dense and complicated. Anything beyond here is more the realm of the material and biological sciences. And that tends to be the case a bit more than the social sciences. If we can find stuff, extraordinary. And we have been finding a lot of stuff. But that's harder information to parse, especially individual stories. And we're here because we're trying to find cool conflict nuggets, right? So if you look at that first couple set of categories, these are relatively known spaces. 90% of our stories that we experience take place in one of these two windows. If you look at the last two categories, these are pretty far, they're poorly documented, and it's not easy to gain further documentation. That can be a hard window to put things into, but it's possible. I'm basically suggesting that the sweet spot is right here in the middle, in these two categories. Yeah, it's done now. There's no more that's going on this slide. It's this part that I think that you can have the most potential with, because it takes a little bit of work, and because it takes a little bit of work, it won't be the most obvious thing. The other stories won't already be about that. All right, time for another example. So, can you work out what country called itself this a long, long time ago? That's right. So, for hundreds of years, Cambodia, as they called themselves, had grown into the pinnacle of civilization, irrigated by a potent combination of local culture, Indic philosophy, mega-projects, and economic might. It filled its capital city of Angkor with extraordinary bas-reliefs, the ones that you know very, very well, and at first, of Hindu tales, like this one on the right. Angkor was the center of Cambodia, and Cambodia was the center of the world, untouchable. Take a look at this calm prince. This guy, on the left, stayed away from the affairs of court for most of his life. But when neighbors, a neighboring country, raided and burned Angkor itself, this prince came back, united his people, and took the throne at the ripe age of 61. He led Cambodia into a new golden age for the next 30 years. He was very long-lived, expanding his city and his empire bigger than ever before, bigger even than its contemporaries, the Byzantine Empire of the time. Did you know that? I didn't know that. That's why this is worthwhile to go deeper into. There was one difference. For many years, for hundreds of years, Cambodia had been led by Hindu monarchs calling themselves god kings, self-deifying, okay? And in the last few monarchical regimes, they were particularly tyrannical. Jayavarman VII was different. He was more open-minded, he was more civic, he was more welfare-oriented, and most of all, he was a Buddhist. So if the last conflict nugget that we talked about was about two people in the middle of a struggle for dominance with each other, this one is about the forces of one person struggling against the inertia of his society that had for hundreds of years been going in a very specific direction. So imagine hundreds of years of this religion tied up intricately with every single part of social life, intertwined also with the deified leaders themselves. And then imagine that society contending with an unimpeachable leader of a different faith. Why unimpeachable? Because he led them from military perdition. Not only that, he fully conquered the very invaders who had humbled them just before. He visibly built up the grandeur of his city and expanded the reach of his empire. He even gave full tolerance to both Hindu and Buddhist parts of society. If you go to Angkor Wat today, it's not just Angkor Wat, it's also the whole extra new city that he built. If you were a beneficiary or a true believer of the old regime, someone like this is a huge threat to you, and it's a threat that you have to combat over generations. How great of a story is this, right? Like, this is an insane story. If you have a conflict nugget like this, more about person versus society rather than person versus person, where could you use this? Well, you could let a new, unimpeachable leader who nevertheless represents a vastly new way of life be the political backdrop of your retro JRPG. You could have your protagonist only see this new leader's point of view from the perspective of the old regime, thinking of that new person as the big bad until the end, when you let them make their own choice. Or you could have this general idea apply in a much more casual setting, in a workplace setting with a new boss. Maybe you have an infamous guild leader in a fantasy RPG. In any of these, the nugget would be about a new leader representing change and success in a way that rapidly divides the old consensus. Now, you don't need to get just one single conflict nugget, and you don't need to show any of your research to anyone, by the way. In fact, it's often best if you don't at this stage. The point is to build a wide set of moments that you can recall and you can draw on later. So, you'll see what I'm getting at with this. You don't need to justify your curiosity in something. Be curious, explore something, and then when you go deeper, take it to a different level, right? Maybe there's just something that you're interested in for some other type of reason. There's a particular period that interests you, say this one, about a medieval Indonesian empire. Maybe you visited the ruins of Hampi. This was the center of a thalassocratic empire itself, a long, long time ago. Maybe you're just curious about certain parts of the map, a historical character perhaps. Maybe there's a specific fact that comes up to you. Either way, you can start with that hook. Then you go through the process of getting yourself an overview. This can be very straightforward. You can do this through simple methods. Just do it from a lot of different sources. Watch documentaries, read the CIO World Factbook, look up a few things about this country. You can go macro or micro with finding a historical hinge point, but almost every country, when they look back on their own history, already does this for you. Okay? If you have a specific interest that you're curious about, cities, let's say, or gender disparities, you can look for micro hinge points on just that one subject. And again, that country will help you out with from their own historians and their own historiography. Now, this part is the key, right? See if you can find a historian from a part of the world that has, this part of the world, right, that has published something in a language you can read. You can use bibliographies, you can use Google Scholar, you can check out local newspapers and magazines and translate them. You can look up the name of a major bookseller in that country and go to their history section. You can find, you'll often find for a lot of former colonies, you'll find a lot of imperialist scholarship. That's not necessarily a bad starting point, it just shouldn't be your ending point. Keep in mind that most Asian and African former colonies have been independent for about 80 years, and most American former colonies have had about 200 years since independence. In both cases, that's more than enough time for them to have developed a robust sense of academia in their own countries. You can look things up, it is not impossible, and then record it. Put it down somewhere in a way that's specific to you and that's memorable, right? In a way that you can do something about this. So, am I just telling you here to do basic undergraduate history research? Is that like the point of this? Well, yes, perhaps, and also no, right? I am reminding you a bit how to do this, but I'm also saying broaden your inspiration. So we are not telling the same stories time and time again. They are great, but if all of our inspiration comes from the game that came out 2 years ago, and that game was inspired by the one from 2 years before that, we are going to be telling the same stories. If you collect and write down interesting conflicts in history, you are guaranteed that these could be, potentially, the basis of gripping human conflict, because they already literally were. All right, so this, of course, isn't only useful at the start of a game project. You can also do this if you're solving a very specific narrative problem. Maybe you need to invent a town your protagonists are going to visit. You need to make it feel real. Maybe you have an alien colony, an alien race, and you want to more gently evoke the combination of two different cultures. Whatever it happens to be. Maybe you have an existing IP and you're trying to find a cool midpoint here that fits within your universe. Almost any of this could work for you. So, if you do, however, have a specific historical case, I refer you to a talk from yesterday. Because the truth is, if you do have a specific thing you're trying to do, there are other things you can do. And that's not what this talk is going to go into detail about, but they exist. There are tools, there are abilities, there are things that you can do, and they are achievable. That second one, no one ever does. Do you know that embassies, half of their job is to encourage good representation of their country? They have literal people that are being paid government money to help spread their culture. Just give them a call. Just give them a call. I did for the Mexico story, and we got some great information, right? If nothing else, they'll refer you to people that you can look up. Almost every country has a national museum. You can contact people there. You can email a professor of history that specializes in this area. They'll at least tell you where to go. We don't do this in our industry that much, but other media do. We should be taking advantage of all of those same resources. So, final note. If you come from a culture, a society, a language, an ethnicity, or a class that happens to have a lot of power relative to the places that you are researching, even though you're using that research for fictional settings that are converted and changed, just tread carefully, watch yourself, observe your own reactions, challenge your interpretation, notice your own intuitive judgments. Listen more to the voices of the people that you learn about, the voices of people who have lived and died on this beautiful planet, wherever they were from, whenever they lived. Find out what drove them and respect the passions that they poured into their lives. And if you do, people will, as they always can, and as they always will, inspire you. Thank you.